Did you know that there are two different kinds of belly fat? And depending which kind you have, the solution will be different in order for you to lose it for good. Hi, I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, and welcome to the Wild Wisdom Show. I'm a functional medicine doctor transforming women's health with root cause solutions. And today we're going to be talking about it's not about calories, discover the real causes of belly fat so you can lose it for good. Because when you know the root causes of the condition that you're experiencing, then you can address them and hopefully even reverse it. So we are going to go over many things that you can do to reduce and lose your belly fat. So the important thing to know is that there are actually two different kinds of fat in the body and in the belly. One kind is called subcutaneous, and one kind is called visceral fat. So, this is the belly fat specifically that we're talking about. And subcutaneous means the fat that accumulates beneath the skin. So, in the belly, it's between the skin, but above the muscles. So, you can pinch it between your fingers, right? So you can, if you go to your belly and you kind of, suck in your belly and then you pinch your belly, the fat between your fingers, if you can, pinch it between your fingers, that's called subcutaneous fat. Now, the thing about subcutaneous fat is that that's a kind of fat that you can find in places beyond the belly. You can find it in your thighs, in your hips, in your buttocks, as well as your belly. Versus visceral fat is fat that is actually inside the body, like inside the deep cavity of the body, in between the organs. So it's fat that is now accumulating and starting to pad around, the heart, the lungs, the abdominal tissues, the gastrointestinal tract. So it's not beneath the skin, it's actually beneath the muscles, even so deeper than the muscles. So you can't pinch that fat, it's deep inside. And it's important because that fat, the visceral fat, is a very, very dangerous kind of fat. The subcutaneous fat is more related to calorie balance. So, how much you eat versus how much energy you burn, versus the visceral fat has been linked to a whole host of medical conditions that subcutaneous fat has not been linked to as much. So, it has been linked to increased risk of insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes. It's been linked to high cholesterol, hypertension, heart attacks, and heart disease, Alzheimer's disease. So people with that visceral belly fat have a much increased risk of Alzheimer's disease than people without the visceral fat. It's been linked to cancer. And if you do get an infection, like a viral infection such as COVID, your response to that infection will be much worse. You'll get a much more severe response to that infection. That's been proven in research. And why is that? It's because the visceral fat, that deep belly fat and not the superficial belly fat, actually causes inflammation. And this is something that is absolutely fascinating because we tend to think as fat as just a storage depot for excess energy, excess calories. But visceral fat is a very different kind of fat that you don't find anywhere else in the body, where it is producing a lot of inflammation. So it actually pumps out inflammatory chemicals, like things that are called cytokines, for example. And these chemicals float around in the body and cause inflammation locally in the gut area, but also throughout the body. And that's why it's been linked to increased hypertension, high cholesterol, cancer, Alzheimer's. So it can even affect the brain. So this is why we need to be very much aware of the fact that it's not just about the looks, it's about the underlying health issues and health impact that it has when you have that visceral belly fat. And so addressing that belly fat is so key, not just for looking better and feeling better, but for actually being healthier now and in the long term. So the interesting thing is that people can have both subcutaneous fat, so that kind of fat padding, that superficial fat that pads the belly. And you would typically, if you have subcutaneous fat, it's not just in the belly region. You might find it again in your thighs or your buttocks, your hips, maybe on your arms. But the visceral fat, you're going to find primarily in that abdominal region, in the belly. So, but you could have both. You could have a mixture of both. So one question that people have is, how do I know the difference? Do I have subcutaneous fat? Do I have visceral fat? Because not only are the health risks different between the two, the way to lose it is also different because the root causes are different between the two. So, the way to know whether you have visceral fat, the very best way is an MRI. So, MRI is magnetic resonance imaging, where you get imaging of the soft tissues, including the fat, and they would have to do it of your belly. Now, the problem with MRI is that doctors will typically not order an MRI just to assess the presence of visceral fat. That currently is not standard of care. You would have to pay for the MRI out of pocket. That could be a few hundreds of dollars, depending on where you live. And you would also need a doctor reading that MRI who can interpret it and determine when is it too much belly fat, visceral fat. The other ways that can be done are a CT scan, which is not as good, but still used in research, for example, and can also be ordered by your family doctor or other doctors. But as I mentioned, it's not a standard of care, so they typically would not order it just for the purpose of assessing which kind of fat you have. Though maybe in the future that is something that could be done, because now we're linking that these risks of medical conditions are so high that one day they may be doing it as a prevention medicine, for example. Another way to do it is in the office with a DEXA scan, and a DEXA scan is a low dose x-ray that they do. It's similar to the kind of testing that is done for diagnosis of osteopenia and osteoporosis. Not every doctor has this. In fact, most doctors don't have this in their offices. Some functional medicine doctors and naturopathic doctors, and some doctors involved in this area of care, of primary prevention and treatment, will have this, but it's a bit harder to find. Another type of test is called the caliper body fat measurement. So it's basically like a metal instrument that pinches fat between it, and they'll pinch the fat around the belly and the thighs and the hips, but that's more for assessing subcutaneous fat, not so much visceral fat. Then there's the at home tests like the body mass index or BMI, the waist to hip ratio, and the pinch test. You just simply pinch the fat over your belly to see how much of it is subcutaneous. But the very best test to do at home, based on research that we know of, is called the waist to hip ratio. So, the way that you do this test is you take a tape measure and you wrap it around your waist at the smallest point, usually the belly button, and you record that number. Then you take that tape and you wrap it around the widest point around the hips. So, you go down past the waist into the hips, the widest point at the hip region around the thighs, and then you record that number too. And then you divide the waist size by the hip size, and you're looking at the ratio. If your ratio of waist to hip is greater than 0.85, if you're a woman, that is concerning. That is increasing the probability that you have problems with visceral adiposity. And what I want you to understand is that you can have visceral adiposity and be very slim otherwise. So you could have no subcutaneous fat, your slim arms, slim legs, but you have visceral adiposity. So this waist to hip ratio is very, very important for that. And for men, the number is slightly different because they're not expected to have a slimmer waist. So the ratio is anything over 0.9 for men. And this is proving to be a very good at home test to see if you have any issues with visceral adiposity in specific. Now, body mass index is, your weight to height ratio. And the problem with BMI is that some people can actually be very fit with a lot of muscle mass and have very high BMI. So again, it's that waist to hip ratio that is most useful for determining if you have any problems with visceral fat. And if you're joining me live, please feel free to put your comments, your questions in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them for you today. Now, the thing about visceral belly fat is that calorie balance, so energies in versus energies out, so how many calories you take in versus how much you exercise out, may not actually be enough depending on what the root cause is. Whereas for subcutaneous fat, it's often important to look at calorie balance. Not to say that that's not important for visceral fat, but it's got more root causes. And I'm going to go into what are these other root causes of visceral belly fat and why it is it that we experience this specifically. So let's dive in to other root causes beyond eating too many calories and not exercising enough, that could be leading to your visceral belly fat. And this is important because I run into a lot of people who are, doing all the right things in terms of looking at their calories and exercising, but they're still not shifting that stubborn belly fat. So let's take a look and see what could be the other causes. So I'm going to list them all here, and then we're going to dive into them to get a really, a very specific idea, because we need to know the details of this information. So the other root causes include toxins, artificial sweeteners, gut microbiome dysfunction and leaky gut, hormone deficiency, stress, inflammation, dental disease, and specific medical conditions that I'm going to go over with you. So let's dive in. Root causes. Let's start off with root causes being toxins. So, toxin number one is alcohol. Now, I'm not saying that drinking a little bit of alcohol every now and then is a problem, but research is showing that moderate alcohol consumption in even healthy women has been related to an increase in belly fat. And what we have to understand is that, having a glass of wine occasionally on the weekend with, friends in a restaurant or something like that, that's not moderate alcohol consumption. Moderate alcohol consumption is drinking even one glass of wine a week every day of the week. That would be considered moderate. So if you come home and you have one glass of wine at the end of a very busy day and you're using it to de-stress, sort of self-medicate, self-soothe, this could be enough to contribute to increasing belly fat. That's what the research is showing. Now, what I'm doing is on YouTube, I'm showing the research title plus the PubMed ID. So if you want to find that research, please go ahead and look it up. If you're on podcast and you're listening to this, you might have to pop over to YouTube to see those references in the banners. So alcohol can increase our risk of belly fat. And so you might be very low on your calorie consumption and exercising quite a bit. But if you're having too much alcohol for your body, it will cause belly fat. So the problem is that ability to tolerate alcohol changes with age. So what you were able to tolerate in your 20s and 30s is different from what you're able to tolerate in your 40s, 50s, and beyond. And that's to do with many changes, including hormonal changes, changes in your ability of your liver to metabolize the alcohol. So what you were able to tolerate before may not be what you're able to tolerate now. And that's something that people often forget and don't shift as they age. Toxins number two is added sucrose and fructose. So now sucrose is basically table sugar and fructose is a part of it. So sucrose is made of glucose and fructose. And you'll find sucrose in things like table sugar, but you'll also find them hidden in ultra processed foods. And if you overconsume fruits that have been made into juice or fruit smoothies, you start getting a lot of excess sucrose and fructose. So this study here looked at beverages where sucrose, table sugar, had been added in. So, it could be juices, it could be Coca-Colas, it could be teas, coffees where you're adding in table sugar. And they found that over 6 months of the study where they were purposefully, sweetening these drinks, these people in the study had an increase in fat in the visceral fat. So belly fat specifically got bigger. So not subcutaneous fat, but belly fat. So that was interesting. Now, another study showed that actually of the fructose glucose combination in sucrose, fructose is the biggest problem. And I see this often where people are saying, I eat pretty healthy. I have a pretty healthy diet, but I don't know why I've got this belly fat. I've got this fatty liver. I don't drink a lot of alcohol, but I still have fatty liver or I have the stubborn belly fat. The thing that you have to understand is that fructose is a very common food additive in ultra processed foods, even in foods that are labeled as healthy. So protein powders, protein bars, granolas, these foods, they have added things like fructose to them. And it may be very obvious, like high fructose corn syrup, for example, or it could be less obvious, like agave syrup or coconut nectars. These are very high in fructose. Also, fruit juice, if you take fruit and you juice it, you take out the fiber, you're left with what is a lot of sucrose, glucose, fructose. So drinking Fruit juice could be problematic. And again, same thing with the fruit smoothies. The fiber of the fruit really protects us from too much of that fructose hitting our gut all at once. But when you blender that fruit, now you're removing that protective fiber and you're getting a lot of fructose, and that could be contributing to these excess problems. So thinking about, your beverages and your foods, where could you be having some excess fructose? Maybe it's some fancy drinks that you're having often, for example, and adding some syrups and things. Maybe you go to the coffee shop and you get that flavor pump or that syrup shot. These things add up and could be contributing to that stubborn belly fat. Toxins number 3 is smoking. So, smoking has been proven to increase visceral fat, specifically that inflammatory fat. So, smoking, never a good idea. But when it comes to belly fat, really not a good idea as well. And toxins number 4 is the food additives in ultra processed foods. And this is interesting because this is starting to come out where certain food additives are actually contributing to inflammation in the gut. And there are studies linking gut inflammation to the formation of visceral fat because the two are side by side. You've got your gut and you've got your visceral fat, and they're literally beside each other. So you can get an inflammatory response in the fat around the gut by causing gut inflammation. And we are finding out over time that food chemists, when they made these ultra processed foods, they were not aware of the fact that some of these food additives can actually cause gut inflammation. And so it's just generally a good rule to avoid ultra processed foods, even if it's been labeled as gluten free and dairy free and low calorie, natural, organic. Whole foods is really the safest way to go, and really minimizing that consumption of ultra processed foods. The other root cause that we're going to talk about next is artificial sweeteners. Now, we may be thinking that we're doing ourselves a favor of using artificial sweeteners to lower our caloric intake to decrease fat. But interestingly, these artificial sweeteners have been linked to the specific formation of visceral fat. Now, not all of them, but the ones that have been studied to date include aspartame and saccharin. And so aspartame and saccharin have been linked to greater volumes of visceral fat, as well as fat in the muscle and in the subcutaneous tissue. So it's interesting because they're trying to understand why is that, right? Because it's not an excess calorie problem, but it looks like it may be a problem with gut inflammation, problems with the gut microbiome, problems with hormone signaling being off. We're not exactly sure, but for now, stay away from artificial sweeteners. Using small amounts of things like raw, unpasteurized honey, 1 to 2 teaspoons a day maximum, is the way to go, because honey in that state, in that raw, unpasteurized state, has been linked to actual reductions in obesity. So, again, as long as you don't overdo it, it's better to use something like raw honey and not to heat it, because once you heat it, you lose all of those raw enzymes and properties that have been linked to those health benefits. Now, I mentioned gut microbiome and gut harm, and that is one of the root causes. And that's been shown in the research too, that dysfunction or problems with the gut microbiome, as well as leaky gut, all otherwise known as increased intestinal permeability by medical doctors, has been linked to visceral fat formation. Now, the gut microbiome is that collection of organisms in the gut. It's the bacteria, the fungus, the viruses, the parasites, and they are there. Everybody has them. There's no way to get rid of them, and in fact, you shouldn't get rid of them entirely, because they are in a healthy state responsible for important functions in our body. For example, a healthy gut microbiome will break down the fiber from your food, turn it into very important B vitamins and ketones, which are really great sources of fuel for the body. And so a lot of the health benefits of fiber actually come from having a healthy gut microbiome. But the flip side is that if your gut microbiome is unhealthy, and I'm going to teach you what it is that makes it unhealthy, you can have the opposite effect. You can actually have inflammation in the gut. lack of those good functions going on. You don't benefit from the fiber in your food. So you really want to make sure you protect the health of your gut microbiome. Now, leaky gut is when the surface of the gut and the gut microbiome lives on the surface of the gut in the mucus lining the gut, but the gut lining itself has to be intact for your body to be healthy. It's like a coffee filter that lets in the nutrients but keeps out the bad stuff. Like you don't want the gut microbiome, for example, going into your body. You want it staying in your gut. Well, the gut lining is responsible for that while still allowing the nutrients to come in. And when you have a leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability, that can cause inflammation locally, which can then lead to inflammation of the fat in the belly and cause visceral fat to grow and accumulate. So here's a couple of studies. One study called an obesity associated gut microbiome with increased capacity for energy harvest. And this study showed that an unhealthy gut microbiome will cause your body to actually pull more energy from your foods, which could lead to that obesity effect. And this study is called intestinal permeability is associated with visceral adiposity in healthy women. This study specifically showed that the more leaky gut, having a leaky gut meant having more visceral adiposity, more belly fat. So anything you can do to prevent or reduce or treat a leaky gut, also known as increased intestinal permeability, will help you reduce stubborn belly fat. Now, what causes problems with gut microbiome dysfunction and leaky gut? Now, if you want to learn more about leaky gut, you can go to my YouTube channel, check out the leaky gut playlist. I've got some information there for you. So if you want to do a deeper dive in that, that's where to go for that. But what is it that can cause the gut microbiome dysfunction and leaky gut? These include antibiotics. So excessive use of antibiotics can cause problems with the gut microbiome, which is why doctors now are being educated along with pharmacists that we really have to pull back on our antibiotic use and be very, very intentional, only using it when it absolutely needs to be used and being very specific with the kind. So a lot of training is being done with doctors and pharmacists right now to educate them about this. When I worked at the hospital, that was something that we were frequently being taught and told about. And if you're on antibiotics, taking probiotic supplements for with the antibiotics 1 hour apart at least, and then 3 months beyond, has been shown to minimize that damage, which is good news because sometimes you have to take antibiotics, right? It can be a matter of life or death or organ damage of the ears or the eyes. So you can't avoid it altogether necessarily, but you do need to be aware of its potential effects and how to mitigate and harm reduction. Heartburn medications or acid reflux, those have been shown to, in longer use than anything between 8 to 12 weeks, cause significant harm to the gut microbiome. Again, on my YouTube channel, you can look up the playlist Heartburn, and I have videos there on how to naturally reverse your heartburn. And I can tell you that people have been telling me the feedback is amazing. It works. Again, you have to know the root causes and you have to do the work and identify them. You may need short-term heartburn medications if you have an active ulcer in order to heal that ulcer. But while you're healing that ulcer, you need to do the work to identify the root causes so that when you get off of that medication, which you must eventually get off of it, and it's actually written on the description on, when you get your medications, and it has that the description of like all the risks and side effects and warnings. It says not intended for use beyond 8 to 12 weeks, depending on which one you get. So you need to be aware of that. It's very, very important. And I've done videos on how, heartburn medications increase your risk of very serious health conditions in the long term. So we need to be aware of that. Over-the-counter anti-inflammatory pain medications like NSAIDs, ibuprofen, naproxen, those harm the gut. They are known to cause ulceration of the gut, scarring of the gut, damage the gut microbiome. Anything beyond 5 days of use, even small doses, can be problematic. So again, check out my YouTube channel. I've done videos on this and what to use instead, including a combination of turmeric and boswellia, studied to be very effective and equivalent to these medications. Excess pesticides can harm the gut microbiome. Again, look for those videos on YouTube where I talk about pesticides and the connection with the gut microbiome, the harm that can do, and how can you reduce the amount of pesticides in your food. So it's not about going 100% organic, but it's about, again, reducing your exposure. Ultra processed foods, as I mentioned before, the food additives can actually harm the gut microbiome. Excess sugar can cause the candida in our gut to overgrow, and that causes an imbalance in our gut microbiome. Too much alcohol, too much caffeine can be problematic. Deep fried food. So I always find it interesting when I go to a restaurant and they have vegan or vegetarian options, and I'm looking at those options because I'm curious. They have deep fried cauliflower. And what I can tell you is it doesn't matter how good the food is to begin with. If you deep fry it, it's no longer good. So I think we know this, but we sometimes forget this and we need to be reminded of it again. And interestingly, too much exercise. So if you over exercise, that's been shown in athletes to cause a leaky gut. So again, moderation is key, not too little, not too much, finding that middle way, that healthy balance. That leads me to the next root cause, which is excess stress. So we all have stress in our lives, but are we dealing with it well? Is our stress perception too high? Do we have good coping mechanisms? And it's interesting because stress causes an increase in our stress hormone cortisol. And cortisol, you have to remember, hormones are messengers. So hormones, when they're made by the body, so cortisol is made by the adrenal glands, and when it's made by the body, it goes around and sends messages to the body. And one of the messages that too much cortisol sends is for the visceral fat to accumulate, to have more fat deposition in the belly. So too much stress cortisol hormone production can be problematic. So it can be physical or emotional stress. So interestingly, that excess fructose I was talking about, one of the reasons it causes visceral fat or belly fat is because it causes an increased amount of cortisol production in the cells of the fats. So in the fat cells themselves, which is kind of crazy. It's like the fat is getting stressed out. And when that happens, it causes increased fat accumulation and deposition. So it's just so fascinating how this all is interconnected. And then it can be emotional stress. So if you're again having a hard time at work or with family, your to-do list, all these things, finding ways to cope with that, whether improving communication with your employees or employers, getting help, asking for help, reaching out, learning breath work, meditation practices, mindfulness, all of these tools that we now have at our disposal, we need to use them and liberally use them in order to decrease our perceived emotional stress. Here's a study that I found fascinating titled Stress and Body Shape. Stress induced cortisol secretion is consistently greater among women with central fat. So another way that doctors call belly fat is central fat. So this is published in research, proven. This is not something that I'm just making up here because it sounds cool and you've heard it on social media. This is actually really been studied. So I wanted to share this with you to show that and really drive that home. Now, the other root cause is lack of sleep or too much sleep, which is very interesting because we all know that sleep deprivation is not great, but also excess sleep is a problem. So here's a study that was titled Short Sleep Duration and Visceral Fat Accumulation in Adults. They followed adults over time and noticed that for adults, as they decreased how much sleep they had or had too much sleep, their visceral fat would get greater. But if they corrected that back to the ideal 7 to 8 hours of sleep, the visceral fat would go away. So what they determined as too short was anything less than 6 hours of sleep a night, and too much was more than 9 hours of sleep per night. So again, just like exercise, you don't want too much or too little. You want to find that balance. And same thing with stress. A little bit of stress is good. It gets you up in the morning, keeps you motivated, keeps you ambitious, keeps you engaged and interested. But too little can be problematic. You're apathetic, not doing very much, and too much can lead to burnout and too much cortisol secretion. So this is always about, again, finding that middle way and what works for you. The next root cause is inflammation. And this is very fascinating because this is all interconnected. Every single thing I've talked about so far causes inflammation, the root causes, which in turn can cause visceral fat accumulation. So inflammation can come from your diet, both your foods and your drinks. It can come from stress, the toxins, the lack of physical activity or too much physical activity, lack of quality sleep, implants, and hidden infections. Now, implants and hidden infections, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this. Implants can cause a low grade inflammation in the body. The body's reacting to the foreign tissue or the foreign material, and it's causing an inflammation that either can be localized in the area or that inflammation can start to spread in other parts of the area. So if you have dental implants, breast implants, hip implants, anything that is foreign material, that can cause a low grade inflammation. And low grade inflammation could either not be a problem or it could be a problem. And maybe depending on your genetics, maybe you're more sensitive to that inflammation. And inflammation is a major root cause of every single chronic disease: hypertension, high blood pressure, strokes, heart attacks, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, cancer. I could go on and on. So you have to pay attention to that and be aware that if you have fixed your diet, fixed your exercise, your stress is good, your sleep is good, you've minimized your toxins exposure, and you're still experiencing signs of inflammation like the belly fat, could be acne, skin issues, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, other kinds of inflammation conditions, you may want to look at your dental implants, your breast implants, other implants, and you want to talk to a specialist who understands these conditions. So, for example, dental implants, you would be looking at a biological dentist who does things like CT scone, CT beam scans or beam cones. Sorry, I think I'm getting this right now. CT beam cones. And that's a specific kind of imaging that you do of the jaw to see if there's any hidden infections below your implants or around your implants, or where your wisdom teeth have been removed, or where you have deeper infections, because these are new technologies or new uses of old technologies that are being used and being shown to be better at detecting these hidden infections. So your regular dentist may not be able to detect this for you. You may have to find what's called a biological dentist who does this kind of more in-depth tests. Same thing for a breast implant. You want to work with someone who understands that the inflammation may not show up on imaging like mammograms or even MRIs. You may need to do something like a thermography, which is an ultrasound that detects heat, looking at localized inflammation in the tissues. So working with a specialist, and it may actually not be the person who implanted your breast implants. They might be very expert at implanting it, but not as expert at detecting long-term low-grade chronic inflammation from it. So that's a bit of a tricky topic, but I needed to, say it out loud, because sometimes people get so frustrated that they can't identify the root cause. I don't want you to miss this as a potential root cause. And the same thing for hidden infections. So let's go on to the next root cause, which relates to the implants and hidden infections, which is dental disease. Now, this is fascinating because, again, a study actually showed the association between periodontal conditions. So dental disease, oftentimes you see it along the gum line. So you see like deep pockets or maybe bleeding of the gums when you floss your teeth. That would be considered a part of dental disease. And they looked at the teeth and the fat distribution in a population of Japanese adults. And they showed that the more dental disease that these people had, the more visceral fat accumulation. And the link between the two appears to be that inflammation, because dental disease causes inflammation, inflammation causes visceral fat, and then you get this vicious cycle of the visceral fat then causing more inflammation. So, again, if you've really exhausted all of your root causes and you're not really sure what it is, look for a biological dentist near you. You're going to have to search it and look around, because you're going to have to physically show up to that person, have them physically examine you and do the tests for these hidden infections and what are called cavitations as well. Now, the other root cause that we want to talk about is hormone deficiency. So, hormone deficiencies can arise as we age or as we experience problems with our lifestyle that are not serving our hormone health, and they can contribute to belly fat, visceral fat accumulation. So, two specific hormone deficiencies that have been linked with visceral fat include too low estrogen, so estrogen deficiency with states like menopause, and hypothyroidism. Now, menopause doesn't mean you're going to get belly fat. The two are not intertwined. But if you're heading into menopause and your estrogen levels go too low, and I've covered this again, why could this happen? You're going to want to check out my menopause playlist. Why is it that you're getting a too early or too severe menopause? There are root causes for that because in a healthy state we do still produce estrogen in menopause. We just produce less. But if we produce way too low estrogen levels, it can cause problems like increased risk of strokes and osteoporosis and belly fat. So, getting at the root causes of why that is, which is often diet, exercise, stress, toxins, all those things. Those are very common root causes amongst different conditions. And in some women, replacing the estrogen with hormone replacement therapy and, including a good quality progesterone in there to make it, well balanced hormone replacement therapy, that may be one of the things that will be one of the solutions to your stubborn belly fat. So, again, going to my menopause playlist, looking at my hormone replacement therapy videos, and getting a better understanding of what that might look like could be one of the solutions for you. Now, the other thing we want to talk about is root causes, including medical conditions. Now, I mentioned this before, thyroid disease. So, having problems with your thyroid health can cause problems with your metabolism because thyroid hormone regulates metabolism. So, making sure that your doctor checks your thyroid health is very, very important. And then, specific medical conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome or Cushing's disease, having excess stress, anxiety, and depression, they've actually shown that women with major depressive disorder have increased visceral fat, and that could be the cortisol. The stress hormone cortisol is being released, and that's causing the visceral fat. So they're looking into the whys of this. The researchers, when they found this out, that was their hypothesis that it's related to that cortisol release. So that's a very interesting, another everything is interconnected observation. So, what I want you to do as well is check my resources in my show notes. This is streaming live on YouTube right now. I'm going to go into YouTube and put some really good resources for you in there for you to check out. And over the next few episodes, I'm going to be talking more about belly fat. For example, the best exercise to beat belly fat, including visceral fat, the best diet, and also some supplements that specifically have been studied to reduce that visceral fat. So, again, you want to take into consideration everything that you should be avoiding, such as the toxins, the excess stress, all those things. But then what are things that you can add in? So, what kind of exercise? And, just as a hint, it's not chronic cardio. That's not going to be the ticket to your belly fat loss. What is the diet? What are some supplements you can use? So, as I create these episodes, I'm going to be putting them into my belly fat playlist. I'll put the link for that in the show notes, and you can always find that again on YouTube, checking out my playlists so you can get all of that information over time, because it's not going to be one supplement that's going to do the ticket or avoiding one toxins. Oftentimes with these conditions, you have to do the holistic approach and do everything all together to get the best results. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please save, share, and subscribe. Sharing is caring. You never know when someone's going to benefit from this wild wisdom. I hope you enjoyed today's show, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or night, depending on when you catch this, and I will see you